Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam: The Sands of Time. It's action and adventure in ancient Egypt in this terrific teen time travel romance. Get your copy of E-Steam: The Sands of Time at your favorite online bookseller today. I was watching a video by The Fourth Age where he was talking about Iceman writer Sina and a statement he made on Marvel's social media where he said that he did not need to know how Iceman's powers work. And that's what made my blood boil as a professional writer. Now, as a professional writer who has been writing articles in nonfiction and fiction, I know that a writer has to know what they're writing about. Because if a writer does not know what they're writing about, then how can they share information with the audience? And from a fiction standpoint, if a writer does not know how a character's powers work or a character's personality traits work, then how can they tell stories about that character? And when your Sina made the statement that he did not need to know how Iceman's powers work, he clearly showed everyone at Marvel that he is someone who is incompetent and is not qualified to work in comic books. Because even when I was a teenager in high school and I would read things like Marvel Age or I would read the Bullpen Bulletins, one of the tenets of working for old school Marvel was knowing all the characters and knowing how their powers work. And because I aspired to be a comic book writer when I was 15, 16 years old, I made it a point to read books like Origins of Marvel Comics by Stan Lee, Son of Origins by Stan Lee, Bring On the Bad Guys by Stan Lee, and to read thousands of comic books, not to mention things like Marvel Universe trading cards, so I could be up to date on a character's history, a character's backstory, and the powers they had at the time. Because as I aspired to be a comic book writer, I made it a point to know everything I could about the characters so that if I got that golden opportunity and was offered a job at a company like Marvel Comics, I could start making pitches and proposals for stories and start writing stories almost immediately. That's what a professional writer does when they are passionate about the subject they are writing about, and that's what a writer does as a professional because they understand that if they are taking on a writing project, they need to know everything they can about that subject matter so they can tell an effective story. And when you're in fantasy fiction like the Marvel Universe, the more research that you do on the characters, the better you'll be able to tell stories effectively about that character. And this is the big problem with your Sina when he makes the statement he doesn't need to know how Iceman's powers work. He shows that he really does not care about the craft of storytelling or the history of the Iceman character. It's all about him telling the story he wants to tell without regard for the character's past history or the character's past powers and abilities. Now, as someone who has studied the Marvel Universe, I can tell you that I fairly know the Iceman character fairly well. Now, the Iceman character, he was Bobby Drake. He's the youngest of the original 5 X-Men, and as the youngest of the original 5 X-Men, he's a bit of a jokester, he's a bit of a prankster, and over the years, he has been a character who has struggled with things because he's a little bit immature. He's an accountant. That's what he trained to do while he was working on mastering his powers, and he's had relationships with women like Lorna Dane, and he's also known as a bit of a thirsty guy as related to women. But because your Sina Grace and the editors of Marvel don't regard Bobby Drake's heterosexual history. They decided to make the character gay, and then they decided, instead of focusing on developing the character's personality and voice based on what Stan Lee established, they decided to make the character just basically be whatever Sina Grace wanted him to be. And when you read an Iceman comic today, you clearly see that your Sina Grace has done no research on the character and has not made any efforts to really develop the character out of superficial things. Because in addition to the backstory on Iceman, I also know that the White Queen entered Bobby Drake's mind, and that's when we started to see Iceman really grow as a character, because he then learned how to use his powers in a completely different way. Because the original Iceman, again, he went from a guy covered in snow to a guy who was covered in ice armor to literally becoming an Iceman after Emma Frost entered his mind and unlocked his potential. And this is all stuff that, again, your Sina Grace does not really explore in the Iceman comic, because it's all about pushing identity politics instead of trying to develop the character and grow the character organically from a story perspective, where we see him taking on different challenges or learning how to use his powers in creative ways. Because that's the old thing about the character that we used to see in old school Marvel comics, because those writers did their research on the character. They read the old stories that Iceman was featured on, such as his appearances in the original 5 X-Men stories like those in The Champions, a book that he was featured in on the regular, the Iceman limited series, the New Defenders, and other comics that your Iceman was featured in. That's what a seasoned writer would do when they have a character like Iceman, because they want to be able to use all of those stories in the backstory, in addition to his media appearances in shows like Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and that incredible episode of X-Men back in the 1990s, where we really got to see who Iceman really was, just in a little 30-minute episode of X-Men back in the 1990s. And this is something, again, that your Sina Grace doesn't care about, because he's not there because he loves the characters. He's not there because he cares about the characters. He's only been hired because he fits a diversity quota and he meets a diversity checklist. And because he's only there because of meeting this checklist and checking the boxes, all he cares about is, at the end of the day, just getting a paycheck at the expense of Marvel Comics and not producing a quality story. And that's one of the things that really angers me as someone who wanted to come into comics ever since he was a teenager, is seeing someone like a Sina Grace coming on to Marvel and then sitting there in an interview bragging about being incompetent and saying that he doesn't need to know how Iceman's powers work. When anyone who read the official handbook of the Marvel Universe knows how Iceman's powers work, and anyone who read Giant Size X-Men #1 knows how Iceman's powers work, because in one of the backup features in Giant Size X-Men #1 is a story all about how Iceman's powers work. And again, all of this information is readily available in Marvel Comics or the Marvel Archives, or if you have an online subscription to Marvel Comics, you can find all of this information. So there's no excuse for your Sina Grace not knowing how Iceman's powers work, because if I can know how Iceman's powers work from just reading official handbook of the Marvel Universe or Giant Size X-Men #1, and these comics are readily available either online or in reprint, then what's to stop your Sina Grace? This is his job, to know how this character's powers work, because if you're going to write a character, you need to know everything about them. Because as a professional writer, I make it a point to know what all I can know before I write a single word. Whether it be a book about men's issues like the Man Crisis, where I had to do extensive research to understand the issues that men are struggling with, or a fiction book like Spellbound, where I had to talk about the late 1980s or the goth subculture. I make it a point to know my information before I write a single word. So if this is what's supposed to be a professional writer at Marvel, then I'm deeply saddened by the state of Marvel Comics, because professional writers like myself, we make it a point to do as much research as possible before we write a single word. I recently did 2 books in 2 different time periods. I did one called Easting the Sands of Time, which was set in ancient Egypt, and I had to do as much research as possible on Egyptian priestesses and the city of Heliopolis, which is now Cairo today. And I had to do extensive research in order to be able to tell my story. And in another story I did called Isis Imitation of Life, I had to do extensive research on life in the 1930s and Jim Crow. So in addition to writing Isis's story and the fantasy elements, I had to do research on the historical elements. And that's what professional writers do when they tell stories. They want to be able to have as many details as possible in that story, so that when the reader comes into the story, they can experience things as if they were real. Because the writer has done the research to take you into that world, to show you how real it is, and that's what allows the reader to be immersed in the fantasy. And this is one of the big problems with these Sina Graces and many of these other comic writers out here, is they don't want to do the work, but they want the job of a writer, and then that's why their stories don't really resonate with the reader. The writer who goes out and does the research and brings the details and gives you that vivid picture, they care enough about their stories because they want to give you the best reading experience. And as a guy who loves Marvel Comics, I would love to give people the best experience with Marvel Comics, but I have never been able to get in the door at Marvel Comics. But for my SJS Direct imprint, I make every effort to give readers the best reading experience possible, and I try to make sure that the stories are the best they can be. And part of making those stories the very best they can be is doing the research and wanting those stories to be good because of the research. As I see it, if you're going to write Iceman, Iron Man, Captain America, Spider-Man, the Hulk, or any character, you need to know how their powers work, and you need to know how those powers function, because if you don't know how those powers work, then how can you create scenarios where the hero overcomes challenges or overcomes the villains in the story? How do you develop that character if you don't know how their powers work? And how do you develop plots that make the character interesting if you don't know how that character's powers work? So when I hear someone like Sina Grace sitting there and saying that he does not need to know how that character's powers work, it clearly again shows me that this individual just isn't qualified to work at a place like Marvel Comics. And if I were editor-in-chief and I heard this guy saying on my social media that he does not need to know how a character's powers work, then that person would not be working at Marvel Comics anymore if I were in charge. Because at my own SJS Direct imprint, I have a standard in that I want my readers to have people on the subject matter who know the characters, who know stories and want to know how everything works. If I want that for my own storytelling, then I would want that same standard for Marvel Comics. And it's sad that Marvel Comics right now has a lower standard than the SJS Direct imprint, a publishing imprint I'm running out of my bedroom. That's what's so sad about Marvel Comics right now, is that you have people working at Marvel who have no sense of standards, no interest in standards, and no interest in maintaining a high level of quality. Because when I hear someone like Sina sitting there and making that statement, that's a statement that in any publishing company would just get you fired, and it's a statement that would keep you from getting any more assignments with that company, because it's a statement to the people who work at that company that you don't care about the quality of the stories you're telling, and you don't care about the quality of the work you are producing. And if you're going to come into work with that type of attitude, then you don't need to be working in comics at all. Because the people who want to be in comics, they are the ones who are going to sit there and read as much as they can about these characters, because they know that every story is an entry point, and every story is an opportunity to make an impression on the reader. And you don't make a good first impression on readers by doing things like saying, I don't need to know how the character's powers work, because it is your job to know how everything works in order to tell a story effectively. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Smithsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.